right. For this week, week 23, we'll once again have 3 Just Mercy quizzes, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So on Monday, 8A group should come in prepared to take the Chapter 4 quiz. We will then read the first part of Letter from a Birmingham Jail, which is the response to the minister's letter that we did on Friday. Tuesday, I'll read Chapter 5 with 8A group, and that'll be the quiz for Wednesday. Thursday, we'll start some new vocabulary with B-Day group, and B-Day group will read Chapter 6 together on this day. Then you'll take that quiz Friday, and then we will cover Letter from a Birmingham Jail, Part 2, the second section of the reading. So, for the rest of this video, I'm just going to kind of read these 2 sections out loud and go over vocabulary and just kind of talk about, what I'm expecting in terms of fulfilling the assignment. So I'll start with part 1, fast forward or dip out as necessary. So the minister's letter was on the 12th of April, 1963. It took a little while, I think maybe a couple days or so, for Martin Luther King to see the minister's letter because he was, in prison. But he wrote his response and had it published so that he could publicly respond to the clergymen, who he addresses as my dear fellow clergymen, since, of course, Martin Luther King is also, or was also, a minister. So, this is the first part of his response to the ministers. My dear fellow clergymen, while confined here in the Birmingham City Jail, I came across your recent statement calling my present activities unwise and untimely. Seldom do I pause to answer criticism of my work and ideas. If I sought to answer all the criticisms that cross my desk, my secretaries would have little time for anything other than such correspondence in the course of the day, and I would have no time for constructive work. But since I feel that you are men of genuine goodwill, and that your criticisms are sincerely set forth, I want to try to answer your statement in what I hope will be patient and reasonable terms. I think I should indicate why I'm here in Birmingham, since you have been influenced by the view which argues against outsiders coming in. I have the honor of serving as president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an organization operating in every southern state with headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. We have some 85 affiliated organizations across the South, and one of them is the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. Frequently, we share staff, educational, and financial resources with our affiliates. Several months ago, the affiliate here in Birmingham asked us to be on call to engage in a nonviolent direct action program if such were deemed necessary. We readily consented, and when the hour came, we lived up to our promise. So I, along with several members of my staff, am here because I was invited here. I'm here because I have organizational ties here. But more basically, I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. Just as the prophets of the 8th century BC left their villages and carried their "Thus saith the Lord" far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns, and just as the apostle Paul left his village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to the far corners of the Greco-Roman world, so I am compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my own hometown. Like Paul, I must constantly respond to the Macedonian call for aid. Moreover, I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again can we afford to live with the narrow, provincial, outside agitator idea. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider anywhere within its bounds. You deplore the demonstrations taking place in Birmingham. But your statement, I am sorry to say, fails to express a similar concern for the conditions that brought about the demonstrations. I am sure that none of you would want to rest content with the superficial kind of social analysis that deals merely with effects and does not grapple with underlying causes. It is unfortunate that demonstrations are taking place in Birmingham, but it is even more unfortunate that the city's white power structure left the Negro community with no alternative. In any nonviolent campaign, there are 4 basic steps: collection of the facts to determine whether injustices exist, negotiation, self-purification, and direct action. We have gone through all these steps in Birmingham. There can be no gainsaying the fact that racial injustice engulfs this community. Birmingham is probably the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. Its ugly record of brutality is widely known. Negroes have experienced grossly unjust treatment in the courts. There have been more unsolved bombings of Negro homes and churches in Birmingham than in any other city in the nation. These are the hard, brutal facts of the case. On the basis of these conditions, Negro leaders sought to negotiate with the city fathers, but the latter consistently refused to engage in good faith negotiation. Then, last September, came the opportunity to talk with leaders of Birmingham's economic community. In the course of the negotiations, certain promises were made by the merchants, for example, to remove the store's humiliating racial signs. On the basis of these promises, the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth and the leaders of the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights agreed to a moratorium on all demonstrations. As the weeks and months went by, we realized that we were the victims of a broken promise. A few signs, briefly removed, returned. The others remained. As in so many past experiences, our hopes had been blasted, and the shadow of deep disappointment settled upon us. We had no alternative except to prepare for direct action, whereby we would present our very bodies as a means of laying our case before the conscience of the local and the national community. Mindful of the difficulties involved, we decided to undertake a process of self-purification. We began a series of workshops on nonviolence, and we repeatedly asked ourselves, are you able to accept blows without retaliating? Are you able to endure the ordeal of jail? We decided to schedule our direct action program for the Easter season, realizing that, except for Christmas, this is the main shopping period of the year. Knowing that a strong economic withdrawal program would be the byproduct of direct action, we felt that this would be the best time to bring pressure to bear on the merchants for the needed change. Then it occurred to us that Birmingham's mayoral election was coming up in March, and we speedily decided to postpone action until after Election Day. When we discovered that the Commissioner of Public Safety, Eugene Bull Connor, had piled up enough votes to be in the runoff, we decided again to postpone action until the day after the runoff so that the demonstrations could not be used to cloud the issues. Like many others, we waited to see Mr. Connor defeated, and to this end we endured postponement after postponement. Having aided in this community need, we felt that our direct action program could be delayed no longer. You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You are quite right in calling for negotiation. Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. My citing the creation of tension as part of the work of the nonviolent resistor may sound rather shocking, but I must confess that I am not afraid of the word tension. I have earnestly opposed violent tension, but there is a type of constructive, nonviolent tension which is necessary for growth. Just as Socrates felt that it was necessary to create a tension in the mind so that individuals could rise from the bondage of myths and half-truths to the unfettered realm of creative analysis and objective appraisal, so must we see the need for nonviolent gadflies to create the kind of tension in society that will help men rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood. The purpose of our direct action program is to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation. I therefore concur with you in your call for negotiation. Too long has our beloved Southland been bogged down in a tragic effort to live in monologue rather than dialogue. All right, so that's the first part of Martin Luther King's speech. So what I ask you to do, just have one task for you dealing with this first excerpt, is I ask about emotion and tone. So it's very, very rare that you can boil down an author's feelings to just one emotion that they are expressing. And Martin Luther King his speeches tend to be emotionally complex. One portion will feel bitter, another will feel respectful and conciliatory, another will feel humble, another will feel enraged. So it's typically fruitless to try to boil down tone to just one word. So I ask you to identify at least two words that you could use to describe the tone. And let me tell you, if you try and talk about like sad or mad or vague, nothing sort of words like that, you're off the mark. So think about emotions that he's expressing, particularly different emotions. Is he expressing something positive? What is that positive emotion that he's trying to convey? Is he also expressing something negative? And what is that negative emotion that he is trying to get across to the audience? So, two tone words. And as you explain why these words are appropriate and why these emotions, fit what he's trying to convey, try to find words, phrases from this first part of the speech that show that tone, that are evocative of that particular feeling. So, this is a reading diction question on identifying tone. All right. Just going to click the next button a few times. There's a lovely quiz. And get to vocabulary. So for this week's vocabulary, B-Day group will start instead of A-Day group, and 10 more lovely words for you. The first one, or rather appropriate one, facade. So the C does have kind of an S sound to it. It's French in origins, and it refers to a front. So this could literally be a front of an edifice, the front of a building. You could walk up to the facade of the White House or something like that. Or it could be an emotional front, a facade that you are putting on to conceal some sort of inner feelings. So a facade of happiness to cover grief, perhaps. The second one, culpable, describes someone who is guilty. So a criminal is quite often culpable for their actions. They are rendered guilty for their crimes that they've committed. The third one, hapless, describes someone who is unlucky, someone who does not possess good fortune. Chronically, unlucky things tend to happen to these people. The fourth one, chastise, is to scold, to reprimand, usually not in an incredibly harsh kind of way, but it can be rather, what's the word I'm looking for? Worked up. If you are in a upset state of mind, perhaps you would scold someone severely. The fifth one, prosaic, describing someone or something that is dull, boring, comes from the word prose, which was originally thought to be, less inspiring than poetic forms. So prosaic, kind of blah. The sixth one, aloof, has an association with apathy, so someone who doesn't really care about something, usually in a superior kind of sense. So sort of well, I don't care about that because I'm too good for that, sort of not caring. Not just a general apathy towards everything, but that isn't serious enough to concern me kind of attitude. The seventh one, wet, is to sharpen. So this could be literal sharpening, the sharpening of a knife or something, or it could be like whetting your appetite. So your appetite has been sharpened by physical activity or long period of fasting or something of that nature. The eighth one, irascible, is irritable. And just note that this is irritable and not irritating. So someone who is irascible is someone who is easily irritated. They are not necessarily annoying or bothersome themselves. The ninth one, quaff, is to drink. Any sort of liquid, doesn't have to be alcoholic in nature, but I might quaff my Gatorade after a very difficult rock climb. And the 10th one, diffident, describes someone who is timid and lacking in confidence, reserved because they do not have the courage to speak. Right, and that's your vocabulary for this week. So carrying on to Birmingham Part 2. All right, so Martin Luther King has introduced his initial response to the ministers, addressing points that they've made and offering explanation and reasoning about why he feels his direct action in Birmingham is appropriate and is timely, and the process that they went through with negotiation and self-purification and the direct action. So now he gets a little bit more philosophical. So continuing to respond to some points that the ministers made, but also giving an overall perspective of the situation in Birmingham. One of the basic points in your statement is the action that I and my associates have taken in Birmingham is untimely. Some have asked, why didn't you give the new city administration time to act? The only answer that I can give to this query is that the new Birmingham administration must be prodded about as much as the old one, as the outgoing one, before it will act. We are sadly mistaken if we feel that the election of Albert Boutwell as mayor will bring the millennium to Birmingham. While Mr. Boutwell is a much more gentle person than Mr. Connor, they are both segregationists, dedicated to maintenance of the status quo. I have hope that Mr. Boutwell will be reasonable enough to see the futility of massive resistance to desegregation, but he will not see this without pressure from devotees of civil rights. My friends, I must say to you that we have not made a single gain in civil rights without determined legal and nonviolent pressure. Lamentably, it is a historical fact that privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily. Individuals may see the moral light and voluntarily give up their unjust posture, but as Reinhold Niebuhr has reminded us, groups tend to be more immoral than individuals. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well-timed in the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years now, I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see with one of our distinguished jurists that justice too long delayed is justice denied. We have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. The nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed toward gaining political independence, but we still creep at horse and buggy pace toward gaining a cup of coffee at a lunch counter. Perhaps it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your black brothers and sisters, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky, and see her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconscious bitterness toward white people, when you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son who is asking, Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean? When you take a cross-country drive and find it necessary to sleep night after night in the uncomfortable corners of your automobile because no motel will accept you. When you are humiliated day in and day out by nagging signs reading white and colored. When your first name becomes Negro, your middle name becomes Boy, however old you are, your last name becomes John, and your wife and mother are never given the respected title Mrs. When you are harried by day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro, living constantly at tiptoe stance, never quite knowing what to expect next, and are plagued with inner fears and outer resentments. When you are forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over, and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair. I hope, sirs, you can understand our legitimate and unavoidable impatience. You express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws. This is certainly a legitimate concern. Since we so diligently urge people to obey the Supreme Court's decision of 1954 outlawing segregation in the public schools, at first glance it may seem rather paradoxical for us consciously to break laws. One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in the fact that there are two types of laws, just and unjust. I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. Now, what is the difference between the two? How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the laws of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. Segregation, to use the terminology of the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, substitutes an I-it relationship for an I-thou relationship and ends up relegating persons to the status of things. Hence, segregation is not only politically, economically, and sociologically unsound, it is morally wrong and sinful. Paul Tillich has said that sin is separation. Is not segregation an existential expression of man's tragic separation, his awful estrangement, his terrible sinfulness? Thus, it is that I can urge men to obey the 1954 decision of the Supreme Court, for it is morally right, and I can urge them to disobey segregation ordinances, for they are morally wrong. Let us consider a more concrete example of just and unjust laws. An unjust law is a code that a numerical or power majority group compels a minority group to obey but does not make binding on itself. This is a difference made legal. By the same token, a just law is a code that a majority compels a minority to follow and that it is willing to follow itself. This is sameness made legal. Let me give another explanation. A law is unjust if it is inflicted on a minority that, as a result of being denied the right to vote, had no part in enacting or devising the law. Who can say that the legislature of Alabama, which set up that state's segregation laws, was democratically elected? Throughout Alabama, all sorts of devious methods are used to prevent Negroes from becoming registered voters, and there are some counties in which, even though Negroes constitute a majority of the population, not a single Negro is registered. Can any law enacted under such circumstances be considered democratically structured? Sometimes a law is just on its face and unjust in its application. For instance, I have been arrested on a charge of parading without a permit. Now, there is nothing wrong in having an ordinance which requires a permit for a parade, but such an ordinance becomes unjust when it is used to maintain segregation and to deny citizens the First Amendment privilege of peaceful assembly and protest. I hope you are able to see the distinction I'm trying to point out. In no sense do I advocate evading or defying the law, as would the rabid segregationist. That would lead to anarchy. One who breaks an unjust law must do so openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is, in reality, expressing the highest respect for law. All right, so he's really starting to get into some moral philosophy here, the principles of just and unjust law theory. And that is my second question for you today, is explaining that theory, explaining that concept, that kind of religious philosophy, and explaining why this reference, why this explanation, why outlining St. Thomas Aquinas's what's the word I'm looking for? Theory. Why would that be rhetorically effective? But my first question is about figurative language. So I use the word sympathy instead of pathos, but evoking sympathy, of course, is a form of pathos, which Martin Luther King does quite effectively in this piece, primarily towards the beginning of this particular section. So find some literary devices, some figurative language that you thought was particularly heartrending, and explain them, explain their effect and their message. So that is all for this week.